Our guest this afternoon is a wonderful saxophonist, composer, improviser, lives in Chicago. A long time ago won a really famous award that maybe we'll talk about at some point. But he's done a great job, I think, of controlling his career in an interesting way and building audience. And so that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So please welcome Ken Vandermark. So, Ken, we'll start with the obvious question. You have a degree in film studies and you travel the world playing saxophone. How did that happen?
Well, when I went to college, I went to school in Montreal at McGill University, and I was interested in lots and lots of different subjects. I was playing music in high school and in public school outside of Boston in the suburbs, and brought my saxophone with me to school, did some basic harmony courses and almost flunked out. And I figured I'd rather study what I wanted to study as opposed to what I should study. I mean, I had to invest time in it, and I'm very interested in cinema. So the film studies program was basically film as text, like a literature program, but with film as the content. And as I was in school, I became less interested in the academic pursuits. It was very peculiar to me to study in a program called Film and Communications and have professors who used unbelievably dense jargon to explain pretty basic ideas. I thought that was kind of hypocritical. And I liked music more and more. So by the time I got out the last year of school, I made the decision to devote myself to music, moved to Boston, and did day jobs, or night jobs. I worked at a 7-Eleven, the night shift for a year, worked at a hardware store. And in '89, I moved to Chicago, worked at another 7-Eleven for a little while. And
Did you get a good reference from the one
That's
in
how
Boston?
I got the job,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah.
It's true, you know. They made a phone call and I was in, you know. And I did that for a bit, and then I started working at the Art Institute of Chicago in the museum shop because I had retail skills, and I scored a perfect 10 on their math test, which was, they were very excited about my score, but the questions were unbelievable, you know, like someone buys something for $2 and another item for $3, have they spent $5, $6, or $7, that kind of thing. I did well on that test, I got the job, and I worked on the floor for a while, and then because I had these really good math skills, they put me in the accounting department, which is pretty hysterical. Did that for a while, and then went over to the School of the Art Institute and worked in their video data bank, did paperwork for them there. And as that process happened, that was over a period from '89 to like '96 or something. I worked less and less hours. The job at the School of the Art Institute was part-time, and I was playing more music. But the basic premise that for me worked was to, every time I picked up the horn, every time I did anything to do with music, whether it was my compositions or somebody else's, my music or somebody else's, it was always what I wanted to do. You know, when I practiced for something, it was for something I wanted to do. I never played like GB gigs or other things, and I respect people who can do that and compartmentalize that kind of work as their day job and then do the creative work they want to do when they can. Just for me, I knew that, we talked about it a little bit last night, but John Cassavetes, the American filmmaker, he would work as an actor in like Rosemary's Baby and other films, make a lot of money doing that, and then put that money into making his own films, like Faces and Woman Under the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown and these things. Anyway, so for me, I knew I couldn't do it that way, so I worked these jobs and slowly phased them out and got to the point when I could just play music full time.
Sure. So, having like studying film and then working even in the gift shop at the Art Institute and whatever. I feel like other arts influence your music a lot.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
How did that film study and your interest in other arts influence what you do? We'll get back to the business stuff, but while we're talking about that, I want to.
Well, from the purely aesthetic standpoint, the music I make is very influenced by cinematic principles of organization with editing, the visual aspect of film. Like many directors talk about editing being the key. thing that makes film unique as an art form. And I believe that. And I think that the process of editing and using imagery, whether it's hard cuts, jump cuts, dissolves, crossfading, all these elements visually, I think that way, and I can translate that to a musical organization system. So a lot of the music I work with is based on narrative forms, not the standard, let's say, jazz or improvised music compositional form where you'll have a theme and then a bunch of solos and then return to the theme. I find it kind of peculiar that in the 21st century that's still generally the format that's used. And people seem surprised that I would want to do something else. And there's examples of the work of Duke Ellington or Charles Mingus and other people who've done great work with more suites or whatnot, longer forms. But people read books all the time and they don't need to end where the first chapter was, and they can see films that end in a totally different place than where they started. So it seems to make reasonable sense that music can work that way too in a format that deals with improvisation. So film and the construction standpoint has had a huge impact on me. But in general, I see all of the arts as intersecting and interfacing. And I spend a lot of my time reading about people I respect. Like Willem de Kooning is one of my favorite painters, and I'm very interested in the way he approached his work and where it came from. And so my interest in painting, and in a large way the abstract expressionist period in the 40s, 50s in the United States and New York, the way that culture developed and intersected with the writers at the time and the filmmakers at the time, the musicians at the time. You know, John Cage lectured at the Arts Club for all these painters. I mean, everybody knew everybody. It was a relatively small contingent of incredible artists all the same place at the same time. That's the most exciting platform to me. And finding out what they did to make their work move forward, whether it's de Kooning or other people, has been very informative to me in terms of how to present non-commercial work in a world that's more and more and more commercialized every single day. There is a way to do it. There are different ways to do it. And I get a lot of inspiration from a creative standpoint from the other arts, but also the attitude of how do you, like the United States has always ignored the arts. I spent a lot of time in Europe and people always talk about how it's so much better in Europe. And there are things that are better in Europe. There are things that are worse in Europe. And it's strange in a continent in Western Europe that spent so much time committed to everything from education to healthcare and whatnot, that's really always been ignored here, that they adapt the American model more and more from an economic standpoint and from a political right-wing standpoint. That said, the fact that the arts have sort of been ignored and that they cut the subsidy money down and down, it's kind of like cutting something in half into an infinity. I mean, there's so little money spent in the arts in the US. About, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, 15 years ago, I played a festival in Berlin and found out that the city of Berlin at that time, the city, spent more money on the arts than the entire country of the United States. So we're talking about a different approach towards thinking about the arts, how the arts affect economies, because the truth is people go to different places around the world not because they want to visit the business centers, unless they're business people, but they go there for the arts. They go there to see the theater. They go there to see the museums. They go there to hear the music of the place. That drives economies. And gentrification in cities happens because of the arts, for good and for bad. There are poor neighborhoods, and a perfect example is in Chicago. There was a neighborhood called Wicker Park that was very low-income housing, very poor. There are lots of poor areas in Chicago, but for whatever reason, probably because there were a couple of rock clubs in that neighborhood at the time, a lot of artists and musicians moved into that neighborhood. And when that happened, it gentrified. And it gentrified so fast that within, I don't know, half a dozen years, MTV located one of its real world things in the neighborhood where you couldn't park your car just previously. That's a really rapid sense of gentrification, and that was caused by the arts.
To be clear, you couldn't park your car because
it would be stolen.
It would be gone, not because MTV had taken up all the parking.
Right, exactly. I should have been a little clearer about that.
We're dealing with that a little bit in New Orleans. Like, you know, I love that they're making all these movies, but just leave the parking spots alone. Please.
This was a different kind of parking problem, So all these things, I think, inform a way to approach doing your work. And the key is to know the work you want to do, so then you can figure out how to get it to people. If you don't know what the content is, you can follow every trend, every idea out there, and it's not going to take you anywhere because you don't know why you're doing it. You know, and I'm associated with uncommercial work. I mean, that's doesn't mean you can't do commercial work and make a lot of money at it, but know what it is you're doing. Like, enjoy it and love it, whether it's about profit for the sake of profit, which I could argue a little bit about that, or about other intentions. If you don't know what the content is, you're not going to figure out how to get it to people. And that means knowing the content means you don't have to adjust the content. What you have to adjust is the way it's brought to people so they can receive it, understand it, appreciate it. Every time you alter the content for the sake of success, you're diminishing the impact of what you do.
Right. One of the things that I often tell people is make honest art and then find the people who like it.
Yeah.
And one of the, you talk about you do largely non-commercial work, but anyone who does things that are largely non-commercial has a lot in common with people even doing commercial work when they're starting out, and that you still haven't found your audience. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of how you found an audience for your work. When I first became aware of you, it was like there was this buzz, hey, there's this guy in Chicago and he's got this crazy free jazz band and they're playing in these rock and roll clubs. And people keep showing up and liking it. So you obviously found a place where your audience was.
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen? Did you wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm just going to go play in the rock club?
Well, there were a lot of things that happened when I moved to Chicago, and it took a long time, a couple years, which was a long time, to find people to play with, which was obviously the key, because I was playing music and I needed collaborators. But when that was located, the drummer in the band worked at a bar in this area called Wicker Park, right near the beginning of when people started moving there and living there, who did music, did art, did all kinds of things. And he said that we could play there every week. Now, at the time, for the kind of music I play, if you played like once a month, that was like, wow, that's great, you're playing a lot. And at that time, a lot of people weren't going to those shows, and the bass player in the band said, this is insane. I mean, I play once a month with Hal Russell, and he was like an established figure on the scene at the time, and they'd get like 15 people out, 20 people out maybe. And he said, if we play every week, we're gonna have like nobody here. And I said, well, let's do it, let's just do it. And so we would rehearse on Mondays, play on Tuesdays, every week. And for the first half year, people came out, but then it started to pick up. And the people that were coming to the shows initially were musicians who were curious. And part of the scene at that time, there was a lot of crossover between the rock music, the underground rock music, and the improvised music scene. In my case, it was like with musicians from the Jesus Lizard, like Dwayne Dennison, Rob Mazurek, who was there at that time, picked up a lot of work that ended up being the crew that were in Tortoise. There was a lot of crossover, and all that stuff was in the Wicker Park area, and musicians were coming out, and the people from that scene that went to rock shows were coming to our concerts too. And a lot of the shows I went to see weren't improvised music shows, they were the rock music that was happening at that time that I really liked. And I would see the people in the audience were the people that were coming to our shows, and it was like, well, why aren't we playing in these clubs? Why play in the quote-unquote proper place for this music, which was like jazz clubs or performance centers that dealt with other kinds of music that were not associated with rock at all. And I organized a concert at a club called Lounge Acts, which was like the most interesting place where most of the great music from that period was happening. And they were willing to put us on a Wednesday night, and it was a triple bill with 3 groups playing the kind of music I did. And it was a huge success. There was like hundreds of people there. And I'm like, that was it. Okay, we're playing in the wrong place. And very quickly, things shifted, and the band I was in later, which was a quintet, started a series at a place called The Empty Bottle, and we played every Tuesday night, and the same thing. We would rehearse on Mondays. I'd come up with new music to play every Tuesday. And we did that for it was close to 10 years. We would play, and definitely in the main stretch, I would say there was a solid 6 or 7 years, we played 50 shows a year there. And we had, like, at the strong section, between 100 to 150 people every single Tuesday to see us play. And that wasn't because we were playing jazz musicians' version of rock music. We were playing our music, but we were presenting it with the attitude and the intensity of the kind of music that that audience who went to that rock club all the time would go see. Aesthetically, the technical details had differences, but the attitude was really the same. And that was a big factor into changing the scene in terms of like where you put the music. And you need to find your audience, and that was part of the process, was discovering that.
Right, yeah, finding the people who, there was a commonality,
Yeah.
and you found an audience that way. So you mentioned y'all played at the Bottle for that period of time. During that same time, you and John Corbett were presenting
On Wednesday.
other shows on Wednesday nights. And there's really grown to be a sort of tradition or standard practice in Chicago of musician-presented weekly series. And I kind of carried some of that tradition down here into the series that I run. How did that come about? How did it get from being, okay, I have a gig every week, to I want to do this work to present other people or build community? What's the motivation behind it, and sort of how did that grow?
Well, I mean, from the beginning, you know, if you're a musician, your motivation is to have gigs. And so it was really clear that if there were places to play that put on shows, when the musicians ran the series, and it was all volunteer work, you know, we haven't been paid for doing that. The way you got paid was in the shows. It wasn't like a fee or whatever,
Right.
a salary. It was just self-evident. So if there's a series on Wednesday nights, the day after we played at the Bottle with my band, that brought in people from out of town, other people in town that played, that meant there was a chance that some other project I did would get a gig too. So it made just logical sense to participate in that. And over the course of time, there were more and more weekly series like that, to the point where there was something pretty much every day of the week, organized by different musicians or volunteers connected to the music. But there were a lot of other factors that went into this, and I mean, in a way, if I talk about it this way, it's like, oh, there's like this logical step-by-step process that I, quote unquote, had some control over. But there are a number of key factors that I had absolutely no control over. One of them was Wicker Park. And the fact that early in that process, we got a gig in Wicker Park and accessed a whole audience that maybe I would have discovered later on, but certainly not that quickly. The other thing that happened was that the media in Chicago, the radio, the newspapers, people around my age were coming into positions of quote unquote power. They were people who wrote for fanzines when you used to make them and, you know, Xerox them and pass them out, to writing for newspapers in the city. And they were fans of this music. And they suddenly could write about it and promote the shows. And at that time in Chicago, if you got a Critic's Choice in the Reader, for example, or written up in the Tribune, people went to those shows, whether you were a local musician or someone from out of town. It had a huge impact on the scene. And Chicago, like New Orleans, is really a music city. So that was a factor I had no control over. The same thing with radio. John Corbett was a presenter for years and years in Chicago. Now he runs an art gallery. He was the main factor bringing in Europeans. I had no access to that except through him. I met tons of Europeans who I still work with now because of his influence. I had no control over that. He worked for 2 college radio stations. After graduating, he was like, you know, a mentor for lots of the DJs there. He loved and loves this music and filtered tons of information to DJs who did jazz shows every day of the week. And that became like a massive impact on what the people in college were listening to at the time. And those students were the ones that came to our shows. So there were like all of these factors that were beyond my control that contributed to making a real paradigm shift in the landscape of what could happen in Chicago for this particular kind of music.
And you've done, you've sort of taken some control of how your music gets presented and coming up with ways to present your music. And more recently, you've taken more control of how your music gets sold. You just recently started your own record label. Talk a little bit about your experience with other people's record labels and how that's influenced your decision to do some of this yourself.
Well, as you can probably tell from my rants, I take what I do very seriously, and I think that what I bought is not a really easy standard of life. I have to be on the road 7 months a year or whatever. But what I do have is artistic freedom. And like, that's the thing that's key to me. I protect that very, 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 very strongly. I've always worked with independent record labels who have always given me complete freedom to make the records I want. I've always had input on how they look, how they're put out. And, you know, they come and go. I mean, almost all of the labels have been organized, like one person runs it or two people run it. They're very, very small. There's always concessions made, you know. You're not going to make a lot of money selling records at the time, like say in the mid-'90s, late '90s. You know, I'd sell 5,000 copies of a record, which doesn't sound like very much, but for this kind of music, that's a lot of records. As the record industry has completely screwed itself repeatedly over and over and over again, it's actually affected the independent record labels too, because the perception of an audience is it's the record industry. So even people who had really strong passion for the music, like the musicians themselves, they were struggling more and more and more as things entered the 21st century, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, and that's a whole nother topic. But the problem was that even though I had artistic freedom, there were always issues with things getting done on time. You know, and a big part of the way I survive is playing concerts on the road, on tour. So if you have a record coming out, you'd want to have it ready for the tour. And repeatedly there would be issues with this, where, okay, the band's got everything together, the deadlines are all met, et cetera, and the record's not ready. And that's a lot of income. That's thousands of dollars, thousands of euros on the road that come back and pay the musicians in addition to the fees. In the United States, one of the big differences touring in the United States and in Europe is in Europe, in general, your accommodations, motel, hotel room, whatever, and like at least your meal at the club is covered almost always. In the United States, that's almost never the case. You're responsible to get to the club. They pay you a fee, maybe a door fee, a guarantee. You have to pay for your rooms, etc. Lots of times, like presenters in Europe, you get to a train station, they get you to the club, they take care of you. The whole attitude towards it's very, very different, but one of the biggest things is that's a huge amount of money that you don't get covered in the US. So at best, even with a small group, you're spending $200, $250 a night just on rooms, never mind on food. So selling records, CDs, LPs, merchandise, t-shirts, that stuff is key, especially in the US, to making a tour solvent, to paying the musicians for what they're doing away from home, away from their day jobs in many cases. So I kind of got fed up, and it's been very interesting to see, as it's a very new thing, it just started this spring, what it's like to make an LP, the process of that versus making a CD. Trying to look at issues of like, should I be making something that, which to me, coming up when I did, when you get in the van with the records and whatever, and you saw vinyl disappearing, that the formats really have always gone in one direction. You know, like the idea that you would go back to the '78 after the long playing record, the LP, was kind of like impossible. Yeah. And then it went to the CD, and it was like, wow, you can put 70 minutes of music on it. You know? Like the idea that the LP would have a resurgence is like, wow, baffling. And now you're dealing with the issue of downloads and the multiple formats. And if you're independent, like these labels couldn't afford to do multiple formats. They have to choose. And there's lots and lots of stuff about the CD disappearing and this and that. So there's a lot of factors that, as an individual not trying to do it myself, I got to think about differently. And it's taught me a lot. But control, or the idea that you could control some of these factors, over and over and over, it's the do-it-yourself model. Over and over, the more you can do and affect is key. And again, it comes back to the content, because you got to bust your ass, not like 5 days a week, but like every day of the week, towards creating a way to survive doing something that isn't really designed for capitalism. You've got to work in a capitalist model for something that's not meant to be sold the way blue jeans are. And that's a reality, and we can work around that reality, but you have to do it with a lot of intelligence. And if you don't know why you're selling the thing, you're not going to sell it.
So you've also, in addition to the label, formed a little, I guess a co-op is maybe the word, with some like-minded artists called Catalytic Sound. Tell us, what exactly is Catalytic Sound? What does it do? How does it improve your life?
How does it improve my life? That's a really good question. Well, basically, this set of problems I'm talking about, going on the road and et cetera, I make a lot of records. There's at least 100 of them out there, probably more than that. And basically, I document my work. I work with lots of different bands, and on a yearly basis, maybe 6, 7 records come out, which I believe in. And the problem is that you go out on the road, and then people say, well, do you have this record, this record, this record? And then they can't get them because of the labels being so small, and their distribution is bad, and all these things. Well, there's a lot of problems with what's happened to the record industry and the internet. But one of the good things is that anybody in the world can hear my music at any time they want to for free. Now, a lot of musicians complain about that because that's a huge resource that disappeared. But the truth is, and this has been like argued with statistics and whatnot, people who can get stuff for free, most of the time then want to buy it for various reasons. Maybe they want something, an artifact, or maybe they're so excited about it they want to have a copy for themselves. But the idea that things are free eliminates income is actually a misnomer. That's not really true. And I learned this in a very, very strong way the first time I went to Brazil, and I played in Sao Paulo, and there were 200 people there, and they all knew my music. I had never been to Brazil. As far as I knew, none of my records had ever been shipped to Brazil. It was all because of YouTube and free downloads and all this. And they knew the music, they came to the gig, they bought records. That succeeded. And when I saw that, I was like, okay, I've got to think about Pandora's box differently. It's open, we're not going to change it, so let's work with it. And the idea of Catalytic came about like seeing over and over again people not being able to get our records either because of distribution problems or because we can't carry every record we've got on tour. So instead of complaining about it, a group of musicians that I work with all the time decided to put together a cooperative, and we sell all the stuff ourselves through a site, one location, full catalogs, anything anybody wants by any of us can get, and we can ship it anywhere on the planet. And that's worked really well. I mean, I think last year in 3 quarters, because we had some changes with the management and blah, 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 I think it was like 20 grand was made between the people, which doesn't, again, sound like a ton of money, but that's a big chunk of change going towards perpetuating a label or potentially, subsidizing a tour and all these things. Every little bit goes in there, and that's 20 grand that didn't exist before.
Right, I was gonna say up against the $35 I just got from CD Baby, that 20 grand sounds all right.
Right. So that's the thing is like, these are things that we wouldn't have had access to that money unless we had taken the step to say, okay, let's take control. Let's see what the problem is and look at the problem from an objective standpoint and create a strategy to overcome that problem and then find another problem, do the same.
Is there some wholesale level to that? Like if Mushroom Records wants a Ken Vandermark record, can they go through Catalytic Sound?
Well, there's like like Forest Exposure buys a lot of stuff from us and they get a wholesale on it. And so in a sense, we're not like being proprietary about the artists, like, because they work with different labels and the labels, sell stuff or whatever. But very commonly, like if we make a record, we don't get paid a fee for the record, but we get paid in artist copies. So those artist copies are pure profit if we sell it through Catalytic.
Right.
So every dollar is pure profit. And that's a way to get paid, in a sense, for doing the record with a label. Sure. Whereas before, we get those and we'd sell them on the road, or they get caught up in this system, and piecemeal we get little chunks of money. But this way we can keep track of everything. We can see who's buying what. We can follow up with people that come back over and over again and treat them better as customers and things like that.
So I think I know this answer, but I'm going to ask you for them. Is there much administrative cost in running Catalytic Sound? Like, is there a team of guys who do this, or do you and Paul take turns like shipping?
Well, we have a manager who does the nuts and bolts stuff, like the working with the labels and coordinating everything in terms of the artistic level. That's all done by the musicians. But yeah, we pay somebody salary to ship the stuff, so to run it, because we're all on the road too much.
Right.
So basically everything's sent out of my house, like the warehouse for Catalytic's my basement, and this guy Steve, who is a musician too, actually plays a bunch of times now in New Orleans.
I play in his band, that's why I'm kind of being a little...
We're plugging Steve because, but yeah, he's basically, so there's one person, and it's been going better. So a lot of the social media stuff that he was working on, and having a Facebook page and all these other lovely things, it got too much for him in terms of dealing with all that. So we've hired somebody who actually lives in Buenos Aires who does a lot of design work for me for my own label, who's really great with this stuff. So we've outsourced that particular aspect of getting the information out to him. And again, one of the advantages of this online internet situation is that someone in Buenos Aires can work directly with us because he's really good at what he does, he's really affordable, and he loves this stuff.
Right.
So we have the hard copies of merchandise in Chicago, but a bunch of the work can be done elsewhere. Yeah.
Sure. So in 1999, you won a MacArthur grant, which was a little bit of a buzz in the jazz world when the young guy that nobody had heard of won the MacArthur. It would be silly to ask you, like, did it change your life? Because I'm sure somebody giving you a bunch of money changes your life. But how did that affect, I'm more interested in how it affected your art. Did it change what you did or just change how you present what you did at the time?
No, it didn't change the artwork. It just changed the velocity of the learning curve because suddenly for 5 years I had money to do projects that would have been completely impossible, like put a 10, 12-piece group in a bus on the road in the U.S. a couple times. Work with band, like we never get paid to rehearse, and I could bring European musicians to Chicago to do a 12-piece group with electronics and people from around the world, pay them to rehearse, make records with them for about 5, 6 years. That wouldn't have been possible. So basically it was subsidy money that never would have existed that I could access to do huge projects that wouldn't have occurred, and of course I learned a ton doing all that. So it didn't change it in terms of, you know, the attitude towards it or the nature of the thinking about it, but it altered those things because of how much I could do,
right?
You know, that just wouldn't have been feasible. So in that sense, it did change it.
But then the downside is 5 years later, you have all these huge groups, and then the money's gone.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was hoping for, which I was completely wrong about, was that by using that money and putting bands that musicians I worked with in Europe, musicians I worked with in Chicago, the United States, on the road repeatedly, once, twice a year, full-on tours, there would be traction. And the fact is, there was no traction. You would need millions and millions of dollars to get that stuff to have traction. I mean, if there were cool stories about music and doing things in interesting ways, take me out of the picture, but the people I was working with, they were really cool people doing really cool things at home, you know, like in the US, where they weren't playing before. And that story, which you think could be a nice narrative to publicize things, that story wasn't interesting enough. And so in my world, that small amount of money, which was a ton of money, it was, you know, $250,000. It was an amazing amount of money that I'll never see again in my life, I'm sure. Compared to the tens of millions of dollars that the Lincoln Center has every single year to promote their version of what this reality is that I participate in, there's no way to compete with that. So what I learned is that you've got to find other ways to make the stuff happen that are sustainable. I'm not going to have access to $50,000 a year to sustain my activity with large groups. So I have a large group now that's based purely on Chicago musicians, so I can work that way. And I understand that I'm going to do like Midwest tours, shows in Chicago, document that work, and maybe get some festival gigs with it. My scope, my ambition hasn't changed. I just had to change my scope and strategy on it, you know. And I think, you know, I recently, a couple years ago, was invited to be the artistic resident at the Chicago Jazz Festival, and what I wanted to do was bring in musicians from Europe, which they gave me a budget for, fantastic, but part of the thing is to get musicians into Europe, as opposed for me to go to Europe, is that they need work visas to work here, because the dangerous music they're doing is a big threat to everybody, and the jobs here for free jazz musicians. So that costs, I think it was like $6,000, $7,000 just to do the visa process. Never mind the flights and everything else. So that meant a huge amount of money was going to be sucked out of the fees I could pay the musicians, and so I did a Kickstarter. And the Kickstarter, I made $6,000, which basically covered the visa costs, which meant it was $6,000 I could then pay towards the musicians. Right. So it's like trying to work with systems that exist. I didn't go through the grant system. Recently, I've got a friend in Chicago, she's trying to help me with grants, and I'm curious to see where that's going to go. But the thing that was good about the Kickstarter platform is I could present what I was doing to people who followed me as a fan or didn't know about me and then followed it, to support what I did for what I did. I didn't have to change what I did. I didn't have to suddenly declare it as community service or do some kind of interface that really didn't have to do with my work. I could say, this is my work, this is what I want to do, I need help getting this to happen, do you want to do that? And people followed up, and a bunch of them said yes, and enabled more resources for the project, for the musicians involved. So that's another strategy that got thrown in, and it's all about sustainability.
Yeah, the idea of using it like an all-Chicago band is because touring a band when everyone lives in the same city is very different than touring a band where two guys live in Vienna and one lives in Stockholm and one lives in New Orleans.
It seems pretty obvious, but it's true.
Well, it's funny. We talked about Steve earlier. I just did a tour. I play in a band of a guy he lives in Chicago and the rest of the band lives here. And I feel bad for the poor guy because every time he wants to do a tour, like he's spending hundreds of dollars before we've even gotten to the first gig. Apparently he likes us. He keeps hiring us. I'm not quite sure why.
He told me he likes you guys.
Yeah, okay. So you should start thinking about your questions if you have any coming up. You've had a couple, I'm sorry, I was trying to get to where I was going next. You've had a couple of long-running bands that you recently disbanded. Describe that thought process. When you have like, okay, you've got the Vandermark 5, that's kind of a famous band, and then all of a sudden one day you say, okay, I'm done with this, I'm gonna do other stuff. That's hard to do.
Well, again, it came down to the creative aspect and me asking what it was I wanted to accomplish. And that group was together, I think, almost 15 years, give or take.
Because it would be real easy to say, like, this is successful and people know it, and so I'm just going to keep riding this horse.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it was a successful band, and we were going into a European tour with a lot of gigs there, and I felt like I learned everything I could from the group in terms of how to write for it, how to challenge the people in the band. There have been some personnel changes over the long arc of the group, and I learned a lot, and I felt like one of my favorite bands is the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And I feel like they did such amazing stuff, and then this is just my point of view, it's completely subjective, but I felt like, okay, this is their major gig, and they did a lot of other work too, and sometimes would be frustrated that, oh, it's the Art Ensemble, and then they would continue to do stuff, and maybe, I don't know, their heart wasn't as into it, or I don't know, but the work changed, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted the work to be as good as it could be, and stop before it became diminishing returns. And I told the group, I think it's time, we've had our run, and I think some of them were surprised. And the last gig we did was in Mexico, and it was amazing, and that was it. And a few months after that, I was in Berlin, and I was with a musician friend, and he was saying, wow, I can't believe you disbanded the quintet. It was such a brand. And I thought that was the best decision I ever made, was to get rid of that group. Because working with it was fantastic, but from an artistic standpoint, you don't want to be a thing. You don't want to be a category. You don't want to be a brand. You want to be whatever possible. And I realized if I was going to be saddled with a group that was going to define me, and at that time I wasn't even 45, like, screw that. There's enough to do. And I'm really glad. I mean, it was a tough choice, but it was also the best choice because it's allowed me to challenge myself and find new things to do. I still work with a lot of the guys in the group. I know all of them, and we keep collaborating. But that particular project had run its course. And again, it's about content. I knew that. Intuitively, I felt it. And it was time to go on, And I'm really glad I did that because I was right. It was time to stop. Yeah.
We have a few minutes here. Does anybody have any questions? Not everyone at once. There's who's that? That's Jacob up there. I think. Are you going to take him a mic? We get to watch Kevin run back there to Jacob with the microphone. They'll get you by the time we get there.
And also, after the interview is over, I ask that you all remain seated. A bunch of you were still checking in, like 25 minutes into the interview. So we did announcements. You probably missed all those. And any of you who had to make announcements that were checking in, you may form a line here right now. And then after we're done questions, y'all can make your few announcements.
'Cause
When you're booking venues, like booking shows out of the country, how do you go about that? Like, how do you know how many people you can pull? Like, how many, like, what size venue you should be at?
Well, I work with oh, sorry, that was a little loud.
Ken, repeat the question so everyone.
Hey, the question is when you're booking specifically out of the country, but I'll expand to say in markets you're not familiar with, how do you know where to book, what's possible, what you can get away with, so to speak?
When I first started going to Europe, I was being invited to play festivals, so that was like a very specific thing, and then sometimes we'd add a couple gigs near the festival location. But pretty quickly into that process, booking agents approached me about wanting to represent me. So a big part of that is working with the booking agent, and it sounds like, okay, well, the booking agent takes care of it. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's really a collaborative process, because in general, with the touring I've done, I meet people, I meet presenters, I know something about the scene, and like my current booking agent lives in Barcelona. So what he knows is, he knows a ton about Spain, he knows about some other locations, but we're constantly feeding information back to each other about where to do stuff. Generally speaking, the venues I play in hold a couple hundred people. I play without a PA. I keep it to a situation where I can see everybody, and it's sustainable. And then there's the festival gigs that like kind of subsidize the other work. So if I get the ideal thing is you get a festival gig that helps cover the flights. You go over to Europe and you travel in these venues and then come back on that ticket, and that really helps. That's thousands and thousands of dollars. In terms of determining like a market you don't know, I always believe in cooperation and sharing information. And all the musicians I work with, they feel the same way. I mean, I'm here because of a musician, I really, really subscribe to that. And so when I first went to Europe, it was to Sweden, and Mats Gustafsson, who's another horn player, he invited me there. I met a bunch of people, and I brought those guys back. We found commonality in the work, and then the work motivated us to find ways to continue it afterwards. And so those have kind of rippling effects, like so-and-so knows so-and-so, oh, you can book this and book that. And we're all kind of working on a similar scale, a similar financial scale, a similar scale in terms of like awareness and whatnot. It's kind of hard to answer the question specifically, like how do you know? It took time. I mean, there isn't a simple solution. I think trying to do it in a way that's affordable is like key, and figuring out what that is. I mean, and contacting people who make those trips and saying, who do you know, who could be helpful, and working with people that share the resources, because those resources come around and around all the time. Yeah.
I want to expand on that a little bit. Early on, booking locally, what was your attitude about working deals with clubs, asking for guarantees versus just taking the door? And then how has that changed because now, at least in our world, you're a bit of a known entity on the milk carton. No. How did you maintain I want a gig, but I still want to do business in a respectful way to myself early on?
Well, I mean, all the shows were really door gigs. They were all door gigs. And that always made sense to me. I mean, charge what's reasonable, and who shows up pays. I mean, that's just like a cause and effect. A lot of the shows I still do, particularly in the US, a lot of them are door gigs. The best situation is to get a guarantee, especially if you're on the road, is to get a guarantee versus the door. So you get a reasonable amount of money that the person can put up. They know the scene, they know what can happen. They'll guarantee you X amount of money. And then if you have a great night, you can get more than your guarantee, and you split that in some way with the presenter or the organizer or the club. So everybody gets a bit more because the thing was more successful than expected. But the main thing is the sustainability issue. So like in Chicago, like at the Bottle, at first it was great because they had the bar. And at the very beginning, the first few years, the bands got all the money from the door, and they got all the money from the bar. And I was like, that's great. you're a bar, you get all the money, and like we're the band, we're bringing in the audience, you know, it made a lot of logical sense. Slowly that changed and the bands got less and less and then things fell apart. But basically the door gig thing, that was fair to me, you know, it seemed, especially in your own town, because you should be able to figure out how to get the audience out. Like we were talking about doing these shows with the Vandermark 5 last night and getting 100, 150, sometimes 200 people out on a Tuesday night. And like, on one hand, that's like, well, that's a lot of people for this kind of music or for music on a Tuesday night. But Chicago has millions of people and it's a music town. And I kind of felt like, well, if I can't get 100 people out to see us, I'm not doing something right, because that resource is there. I just need to figure out how to get them out to the music and how to see it. So the door gig seemed like a fair thing. And then getting guarantees, if you have a track record, you've kind of earned that.
Right.
Like, oh, wow, this person pulls this many people, or they go and they play to these festivals, or they do this and that. Well, we'll take a risk that that'll translate if they properly publicize the thing, which is on the road why you want to try to get guarantees, because that puts it on the presenter or the club to do some work on the behalf of the show. If they don't have to, they have nothing at stake. Of course, they want people to come, but if they have no financial thing at stake, then they're less likely to push for the show.
Right. Other questions? Really, that's all we came up with. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, is there any way we can hear this music, like now, with the laptop and stuff available?
You want to just like hang out and have like party?
Well, you have it set up.
I'm totally down for the Vandermark listening party. I'm sure that's what Ken wants to do too.
Yeah,
I can tell by the
I'll
look
go
on
get
his
some
face.
coffee.
I will definitely play some of it in a bit. And actually, you can hear us all tonight. Ken and I will be playing right here at 8 o'clock for free, joined by James Singleton and Alvin Fielder. And Eduardo has a question. Yeah.
I have a question. Ken, creating this music, have you tried doing a CD? Have you tried doing a CD and an LP and say whatever other media is available?
That's what I'm doing with the label.
Okay.
You know,
Just for the record, I want to vote. I bought those records on Bandcamp. I didn't get anything physical. I just got the downloads.
yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating right now. So I'm trying to figure out how this will play out. A friend of mine who's part of the Catalytic thing, a really great drummer from Oslo, who also has a label, sent me an article which was really quite interesting about the breakdown statistically of formats, and it was kind of surprising. I mean, vinyl has been coming back really big, and basically, to make it simple, it's doubled every year, but it's still only 10%. And what surprised me was that CDs accounted for 50% of music sales now, which I was shocked by. And then downloads are basically, and there's probably some scattered percentages. But I mean, even with the growth of vinyl, and it's like tricky getting stuff made, because it's there's so much backlog and so many, and there are not that many pressing plants, even with like opening up more hours and blah, blah, blah. It's still a small percentage. I think that it kind of goes in with the collector mentality with the kind of music I play. LP is a much more beautiful format for design. I mean, something that's this big, there's so much more you can do with it than something that's this big. And I mean, the CD, they made tons of mistakes with design. I mean, these jewel cases, and my God, I mean, it's hideous stuff. They've made improvements with that, but it's still a smaller format. So I can understand that with the collector mentality and with all these different kinds of box sets that are being made, these are ways that people are creatively dealing with formats to make them desirable for collectors, not just to get the music out. I like music, so I listen to it all kinds of ways. I don't download music, but it's not like with an attitude that it's horrible or anything like that. It's just that I like objects. I'm old. I like books. I like DVDs. You know, I like the thing. And so I'm kind of married to that. Like for me personally, the idea of putting all the work in to make an album and having it just be a bunch of digits online is not satisfying. I want to have an end result that I can see and hold, you know?
I totally agree that when that box of CDs shows up at your house and you open it up, it's a great feeling of accomplishment. But I'm getting over the feeling of when I have to keep moving the boxes around my garage after I haven't sold them.
That's why you hire Steve, man.
Right, man. Maybe I just need to work on my sales techniques. Maybe that's the problem. Mika, yeah.
Hey, hey, thanks for coming out. I really enjoyed your perspective on music and touring. So, you were talking about touring in Europe and having door deals and some jazz festivals and some guarantees, but how much of that is based on grants and some
None.
None?
In all honesty, I think the grant system in the United States is a farce. It's ridiculous. And having just worked on it recently because someone, like I said at home, convinced me. And she works she teaches at the School of the Art Institute and works as in the presenter education organization systems. She knows a lot about it, and she was really helpful and helped guide me with dealing with the jargon connected to grants and whatever. Personally, I find the whole way they make you jump through these hoops kind of offensive. That was the beauty of the MacArthur. It wasn't the money was nice, but it was that they liked what I did and they wanted to support it. And that's kind of what I think that the arts are about. You get behind what someone does, don't get them to change it. Right. It's like a reverse form of commercializing your work to make it sell better. I don't follow that. So, having gone through the process of trying to write these grants to get money to support this larger group and pay the musicians more and maybe get them on the road a bit more, and then having it not transcend to success, it's less about a frustration, a lack of success, and more about why. And the thing is that because these panels looking at the grants change every year, it's very difficult to understand what they're looking for, how to articulate the verbiage and whatever. And I think it's such a small amount of money in general that the amount of time I devoted to it, I question it. There's a really great writer named Thomas Bernhard, who is Austrian. And there's a book he wrote called My Prizes. And I really encourage everybody who's interested in the arts and who is an artist working with things to read this book. You can read it in an afternoon. But basically, it's a collection of essays he wrote about winning art prizes and getting money in Europe and his response to that. And it's really fascinating. Because basically he wrote from the stance of really fighting against political trends in Austria post-World War II, and he was very, very severe about this, yet he kept accepting the money. And they're very funny articles because it always comes back, but in the end I accepted the money. And as this arc of articles goes, he makes a subtext argument against the way these things are done. And basically subsidy money is a way to put rampant capitalism into well, we did this. We gave you this money. But when you look at how much we spend on our defense system and how little we spend on our education system, in the grand scheme of things, the grant system it's a farce. So you want sustainable activity, do it yourself. Find a way to circumvent it. And if every once in a while you get a grant, fantastic, use it. Use every resource you have, but I would not rely on grants to assist you in anything you really wanted to do because it's a gamble. It's like the lottery,
To clarify a little bit, or to go back on that, people have asked me, why don't you get a grant for the Tuesday night series? Because at some point the grant runs out and then I have to keep running the series. Mm-hmm. How does that happen? But the things that happen in Europe, these festivals and stuff, are largely supported by government subsidies.
Absolutely.
It's not that the ticket sales to the free festival in Sardinia pay to fly us all over there. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of government money behind those.
Yeah.
But it's not like sometimes some of the European musicians will come over here and it'll be funded by their own government to send them here to come play gigs. And we don't really have any.
The perception of the arts are really different in different parts of the world, and in a lot of Western Europe, they perceive their culture as connected to the art that came from there. So in Italy, in France, in Germany, Austria, the arts are part of who they are, like the food, like the geography. The arts have never really been perceived that way on that level in the United States until maybe the second half of the 20th century, and that's too early to make a real dent in terms of perception. So the arts are always seen as like a luxury as opposed to an essential part of human experience. And the truth is, it's essential. You know, I mean, and it drives economies, which they always talk about artists as being lazy and it's a suck off the tax system and blah, blah, blah. The facts are completely the opposite, but it's always spun as like a luxury, and it's not. So I would try to find your own way, to be honest.
Thanks. Well, now that Ken got all dark on us.
No, quite the opposite, quite the opposite. I mean, I like use me as an example. Like I have really, until recently, you know, never looked at the grant thing, you know,
Yeah.
and I won the lottery with the MacArthur. It's like, you know, they were very kind to me by saying, we're giving this to you to find out what you'll do with it as opposed to what you've done to receive it, which was good psychologically because I was looking at Anthony Braxton, Steve Lacy, Ornette Coleman, and people like that who had changed the face of what I do. So I'm an example of someone who's like completely worked outside the subsidy system in the United States, and I survive. You know, it's completely doable.
Yeah. Anything else? I think we have some announcements here.
Uh-oh.
So let's say thank you to Ken. Thanks for being here.